My name is Blair Williams, and I'm here at the Cumberland County Historical Society in Carlisle, PA, on May 2nd, 2022. And I'm here with Terry Nickey, who is going to be our interviewee, and also with me is Terry Mayer. All right, so Terry, the first question I have here is where were you born and raised?
I was born in Carlisle and raised in Carlisle. My family's lived here for about 9 generations. I'm interested in genealogy, so I know my background a little better than the common person. And my earliest ancestors came in here in the 1730s. I had Adam Hayes, who came from Newcastle, Delaware, in about 1732. He's the earliest man. Then I had a Quaker that came from Chester County in 1734 and took out a Blunston license. But my ancestry covers every religious group in Pennsylvania almost. I had Quakers and Mennonites, Lutherans, Presbyterians. I grew up in the Episcopal Church and only became a Catholic in 1991. My family, I pretty much attended church growing up. My family consider ourselves like high church Episcopalians, and there's significance to that because in England, when the church started in 1557, when Henry VIII, actually in the 1530s, when Henry divorced his first wife, but the prayer book was formed and founded in 1549, and Henry died in 1547. But his three children, they debated for maybe 100 years if they were going to stick under the Pope or become an independent church. But the church in England pretty much was controlled by Parliament after Henry died, and his children went back and forth. Mary was a Catholic for 5 years, and then she died. But the son, Edward VI, was a young man, and his ministers, the secular ministers, were pretty much influenced by the Reformation on the continent. So the Episcopal Church in England, the Church of England, was pretty much Protestant for hundreds of years after, until the early 1900s. And then there were a group of professors at a college, Oxford, and they wanted to restore many Catholic customs like religious holidays. Prior to that, communion was only celebrated maybe 4 times a year. They emphasized morning and evening prayer, which goes back to the Hebrew period, that they prayed twice a day. But England, they called it the Oxford Movement, and they restored many customs and things, and that's where you get the high church. The priests would wear chasubles, and they would dress. They never had the doctrines of the Catholic Church, even in the high church. So that's pretty much my background, that I grew up in a church that had more formality, but pretty much my decision to leave and become a Catholic was I always was drawn to the Catholic side, mainly historical purposes, but I also attended St. Patrick's. It took me a long time to decide because my family and all my friends were in the Episcopal Church, but I always liked and had a great respect for the Catholic Church, especially the doctrine and the historical background. But there were changes in the 1970s, and that made me make a change. I didn't join till 91. It took me that long to decide. But Catholicism, especially for the first 700 years, they pretty much determined the theology, the nature, the Trinity, and the Bible was put together. It took 4 conferences in the Catholic Church, 381, 382, 393, and 397. Bishops came together in the Mediterranean area, and they decided what books, the 73 books that made up the Bible, and they were Constantinople, Rome, Carthage, and Hippo. So it shows you the significance of how Christianity started in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean area that had before the Muslim religion was founded. So all those things kind of drew me to the Catholic Church. So that's sort of my background in terms of going over to the Catholic Church.
Now you mentioned always being drawn to the Catholic Church. Is that, I'm wondering, is that connected? And your family was always sort of connected with the high Episcopalian.
Yes.
You said, was that influenced? Are those some of your early memories is of that? And did that influence your later decisions as well?
Yes, because the High Church had much of the ceremony that the old Mass prior to Vatican II had, but it was always in English. And the one unique thing in the Episcopal Church, even in the Catholic Church, whenever the vernacular came in, Our Father and the Hail Mary are still in Old English. And whenever the Episcopal Church founded, they used Shakespearean English. So that was always a unique thing, and that's one thing I always loved, that the Shakespearean language. Now, of course, today in the Episcopal Church, you have all these options. So most churches have at least one service on a Sunday that's in the old Elizabethan English. Mm-hmm. But it's unique in that sense. And the King James Bible is also in Shakespearean English. So those two things were kind of unique. This made them different from other Protestant churches. And with the Oxford movement, yes, that influenced me growing up. I liked the language, but I liked the ceremony. And plus, I didn't know the theology until I started studying it in college and afterwards. And I always thought I knew a lot about the Catholic Church, but I found out once I became a Catholic, I knew the tip of the iceberg, that there's so much, and you constantly learn until the day you die. So there's no easy way to know all the theology and things. But I'm very happy that now I have an exposure, and it's amazing what you don't know, and you have to study and learn it. But it had great significance. Had great significance for what you understand in turn. And I wanted to mention one other thing that's not just my background, but the reason I have this kind of background is not unique. But Pennsylvania had freedom of religion, which was not a thing the Europeans had. And that is attributed to William Penn. And he was a Quaker as a young man. When he was in college, he was drawn to the Society Friends, the Quaker religion. So whenever the Stuarts paid off a loan that William's father had loaned to the Stuart family, and he asked for his payment in land. So that's how he got the colony in 1681, and it was formed 3 colonies in 1682, but he allowed religious freedom. And that's the reason we have all these different types of religions in Pennsylvania very early, and also Catholicism in Carlisle, St. Patrick's. They purchased their land in 1779. The deed does not mention a word about them being Catholic. And that's was allowed because thanks to William. Now, William died in 1718, but his sons continued up to the time of the American Revolution. They were members of the Church of England, but they allowed religious freedom, which made it unique compared to many of the other colonies.
Sort of, not necessarily the last question on your childhood, but I'm wondering, are there any childhood memories of attending St. John's or another church that stand out to you?
My memories, we attended church on a regular basis. When I served, was an altar server from the age 7 on. When I was 7, we would have something equivalent to the old high mass, and you had incense, and I was a boat boy, which carried the container that you had incense in. That was my first experience when I was 7 years old. But after that, I went to college at Temple in Philadelphia, It would attend different Episcopal churches, but I also went to Catholic church on the side just to see what it was like. And also, I was on the borderline many times, but when I graduated, I came back and I still served as an altar server in the early services at St. John's. So I was very active, and I was also on the vestry of St. John's, and they were in charge of the fiscal side of the church and also picking the pastors that would come to the church and things. So I was very active up until the time I made the change. But my childhood of growing up, and I also have many, many cousins that were Lutherans and Presbyterians. So I've had experience of going to other churches and some exposure to different churches. So religion was always a part, and I like what they call the daily office, morning and evening prayer and things. And I still use some of that as my religious background and things to pray daily and things. But the Catholic Church, most of the things originated there. So it was always nice to go back and study how things originally evolved.
I'm wondering, what do you remember about going to St. Patrick's, the church, for the first time?
The first time when I was a teenager, well, when I got out of college, I would go to Stations of the Cross, which are devotional things during Lent. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty much my exposure to actually going to the old shrine church. And it was something we didn't, the Episcopal Church, some have it and some did not, but we didn't have it at St. John's at the time. They had it later on. And it's devotion of Christ's path in Jerusalem and right before the crucifixion and things. They have 15 stations that honor what he went through from Palm Sunday to Easter till the resurrection. And those stations I attended, they usually had on Friday nights. And that was kind of my first exposure. My first exposure of meeting any Catholic priest. I never really had any contact with St. Patrick's at all prior to that. I knew that it was here. Mm-hmm. And genealogy-wise, I've studied tax lists and things and look for Catholics very early when Carlisle was founded and that type of thing. But that was my first exposure to St. Patrick's Parish.
What about in 91 when you decided to leave the Episcopal Church and become I don't know what that process was like of becoming a member?
5 years prior to that, I was on the borderline, mm-hmm. whether to go to the Eastern Church or to go to the Western Church in the Catholic Church. The Eastern Church is pretty much like the Orthodox. Mm-hmm. The saints are all different. The liturgy is different. The theology is the same, but the cultural side of it was so different that I was going to make a change because the Episcopal Church made certain, the high churchman was always a tiny minority within the Episcopal Church. And most people, if you mentioned transubstantiation or the real presence, most people would not even recognize those doctrines in the high church even. Well, the priests knew about it in the high church, but the Episcopal Church never took a stand on those doctrines because they encompassed the whole country of Protestants and former Catholics. So you never really had a clear definition. Those things were not emphasized. Mm-hmm. And the Eucharist was not emphasized. Even the high church emphasized, but they were a small minority. So that's what drew me. But I finally decided in 91 that I was going to make a change. It's very difficult because all my friends and many people that I knew were all in the church, Episcopal Church. But it worked out very well because I had other friends in the Catholic Church, and I've learned so much that mm-hmm. it was for me personally, it was a very good move. But that was pretty much my first exposure. And when I first joined, the Catholic Church in Carlisle was very small. Historically, they founded in 1779 when they purchased their land, but the Shrine Church, the first church was built in 1785, 6 years after the lot was purchased. In the Shrine Church, there were about three other churches. The first brick church was 1806. Then there was a fire, and they built another church in 1859 or 8. But the Shrine Church that stands today was built in 1893, simply because the old church was falling apart, the old brick church. The Father Gauntz was the priest there at the time, and it served the parish for the number of people up until that time. And it served up until the Second World War, pretty much. The congregation was very small, and it was not a full parish like having a permanent priest until 1877. Then it became they had a permanent priest. So you can tell how small it was. But then it started to grow. It grew after the Second World War. The Army War College brought in a lot of people, the different industries in Carlisle. One Catholic told me that whenever the telephone company, United, moved their main office to Carlisle, it brought a lot of Catholics from Western Pennsylvania. That was a great influx. And I think that was sometime in the 1960s and 70s. And Marsh Drive was built, I think, in 1971. And they debated whether to expand the Shrine Church and buy up all the property close by and make a large church, which would not have worked because the Catholic Church in Carlisle grew leaps and bounds, that even if they would have expanded the old church, it would have run out of space and its parking was not good. So that's the reason that they went out to Marsh Drive, which was very good because they could preserve the old church and have a new church with the new emphasis at Marsh Drive. And they've expanded Marsh Drive greatly from the time that they started with the activity center. They built a school there. Sometime in the 80s, I think the school went out. So it has quite a background with two churches, or physical churches there.
Do you normally attend Mass at one church or the other? Or?
Yes, my father was sick for a long time, so when I first joined, I used to go. I liked the old church, so I would go to the Shrine Church on Pomfret Street. But then once my father got sick, to look after him, I got into the habit of going at 5:15 on Saturday evening, which is the vigil mass. Prior to Vatican II, you did not have vigil masses. Everything was on Sunday, but the vigil mass served in place of Sunday. So I got into the habit of going to 5 o'clock at Marsh Drive. And the one very nice thing, they have almost all the masses there. So since COVID, I have leukemia and I have to keep a distance from people. So the 5:15 worked out very well because people are spread out. Mm-hmm. And it's not on Easter and Christmas and the holy days, you're wall to wall people. So I cannot attend any longer on those particular days simply because no matter which church you go to, you're up against people, and I do not have an immune system, but I basically go to the Mass at 5:15. I also do adoration, which we have perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, and that's behind the Shrine Church, behind where the rectory is on Pomfret Street. So I do an hour of that. It runs 24 hours, and I do an hour on Friday mornings of that. So I still do go down to the Shrine Church. And plus, I serve in the archives committee at the church. So we have that in the basement of the rectory. And the rectory has significance because when the Carlisle Indian School was here, Catherine Drexel a nun in Philadelphia who had the Drexel financial background,
Mhm.
and her father was the banker. She gave the money to build the what is the rectory today, where the priests live, and that was sometime in the 1890s. I think it was built, and she donated the money. So it has historical significance that Mother Drexel, then was made a saint, I think in the 2000s sometime. And so that she visited Carlisle, and so that has significance in terms of being associated with Mother Drexel.
So you did attend mass for a little while at Shrine Church. Was there
Yes.
anything that stood out to you about those particular services, or?
Well, the appearance, the Shrine Church, Shrine Church, they brought many of the statues over from the previous church. The church was built, the old brick church was torn down in 1892, and they built the Shrine Church in 1893. It has the architecture of the Renaissance, and the altar is right in the center. I liked the appearance. It had stained glass windows that the original windows, Tiffany, it was always rumored that Tiffany hired people locally to do work for them. And I'm not quite sure. We did research, but we could never quite find out if Tiffany actually did. There's a rose window as you enter the church. It was given by the Beadham family. Mr. Beadham was a Protestant, but his wife was a Schaefer, and she was a longtime Catholic, and he paid for that. His brother gave the same rose window at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, and they claimed that theirs is from Tiffany, but we never could find the proof of St. Patrick's. But all those windows were destroyed. It caught fire in 1923. So all the stained glass windows were destroyed. The main altar and the side altars, the roof caved in, but they didn't destroy the altars, which was very lucky that we still had the appearance. So I mainly attended that church. The mass is always the same no matter if you go to Marsh Drive or if you go to the Shrine Church, but I just liked the appearance. I was used to a structure, to the formality. And St. John's in Carlisle is unique that it has a reduce altar that was given by the Moore family in memory of their mother in like 1892 or 1896. And they traveled all the time, and they saw a chapel in Venice. Had nothing to do with St. Mark's, but they had that design in mind, that they hired people to put that altar in. And you will never find, in most Episcopal churches in the Diocese of Harrisburg, you would not find a church with an altar like that. So they had that. The Episcopal Church did not keep a tabernacle at St. John's. Where they keep the reserved sacrament, but appearance-wise, it was very formal and remind you of the Catholic Church in the medieval era and things. So I liked the formal appearance to worship in. And so that was one reason it drew me to worshiping at the Shrine Church. And the Shrine Church still has that appearance. And whenever the changes came after Vatican II, many Catholic churches, they redecorated things and moved statues. St. Patrick's did do one thing. They moved the altar out to face the people. The custom for thousands of years was pretty much facing east. But the Catholic Church, it's an interesting thing, but they lost that custom even in the Middle Ages, because when you built roads and things, once you had a church prior to the landscape of how the current geography is, many churches, the roads would lead in and they wouldn't accommodate putting the altar in the east that he came into the church in the West. It simply didn't happen. So they evolved to the idea that the people and the priest all faced the same direction. That was the eastward direction, even though physically it was not always east. Now, in the Byzantine church and in the Eastern church, they still would not worship in any direction except east. But when St. John's put in their altar in the late 1900s, they put the altar in the east and faced east. St. Patrick's never, as far as I know, and I'm not sure what the early churches were, if they ever faced east or not. But that is a very early custom, the eastward. And the other thing is, every cemetery in the colonies prior to the early 1900s, almost every burial, they faced east, and it predates Christianity. The pagan people, and I learned this when I volunteered to give tours of 5 cemeteries during Cumberland County's 250th anniversary. And I did not realize, till I did some studying, that that was a custom predating Christianity, that the pagan people thought the gods almost all, and the sun came up in the east. The Hebrew people saw their freedom with Moses happening in the east, that they faced east to pray in the temples. They sacrificed animals because the animals were prayed to by the pagan people, and that's where the early Hebrew people got the custom of having sacrifices because they had one God that they honored, and they wanted to prove that these things were not gods, that many of the people prayed to animals. So that's where the custom came. But they faced east to do their sacrifice. And for the first 300 years of Christianity, when they talked about the table, it wasn't a table that when they celebrated Mass at the table, it wasn't a table in your kitchen or that you had dinner at. It was a sacrificial table in the temples that they sacrificed the animals on. And then, I don't mean to get sidetracked, but it has great significance in terms of the altars then. Once people were free to, after the 300s, that Christianity was accepted. Prior to that, they worshipped a lot of times in the cemeteries, and then they buried people underground in vaults and things, and they celebrated Mass on top of the tombstones of people. And that's where you get these long mesa-type altars that you find prior to Vatican II in every Catholic church. And usually there's a relic of a saint that is put in this center. And that represents the people that were sacrificed. For example, the first pope was Peter, and all the next 33 popes were all martyred. And many people, and that's where many of the saints in the Catholic Church come from, that they were martyrs from a time after Christ and his 12 apostles. 12 apostles is where your bishops come from. And then the disciples, they appointed them afterwards, but that's where you get the custom in the church of having celebrating Mass on a stone altar, and that's where all that came from. So it has great significance of having an altar with a relic in, of honoring the saints that had given up their lives for the church. So that's a little bit of the background of and had the significance of the old churches, and even the newer churches. They still have 5 crosses for the 5 wounds of Christ, and that is still carved into the church. Now, I'm not sure if every new church has a relic in the altars. I'm not sure if they still follow that or not. But there's a lot of customs,
Yeah.
and it's very interesting, and they all have a meaning, but it's sometimes some of it gets lost over time.
I'm sure. You've already mentioned a few of the historical pastors, including, I think, probably one of the most well-known in Father Henry Gans. Are there any other pastors that you remember studying or after you joined in '91 that stand out in your mind?
Well, he was sort of a unique person, a Renaissance man. And
Father Gans?
yes.
Yeah.
And Father Gans he graduated from St. Vincent's Seminary in Western Pennsylvania, but he wrote operas. He was a musician. In addition to being a priest, he had a doctorate in ministry and he had a doctorate in music. That he wrote full masses. He wrote operas. He gave concerts in the different uh, music houses in Carlisle, the different theaters, to raise money for the church. He also had his piano pulled out and set on the lawn, and they would give concerts. But he belonged on the board of the Historical Society here in the late 1890s. He also was on the first church board, so he was a man who put himself out in the community, which was really rare for most priests because they were so. And plus, prior to him, most of the priests were on a circuit that they served several churches. And almost every religion in Cumberland County, it was the same thing. They simply didn't have the money for a full-time minister. But Father Gans was on the first board of the Todd Hospital. He was at the Historical Society, and he wrote the history of the church. And he wrote it before we had all this information on computers and things, and he did a very adequate job of describing. And that's the things that I know about St. Patrick's history all came from his book, pretty much. And he wrote that, I think, in 1896. And it's never been we've never done another history. That's pretty much, and he stopped prior to the Civil War. So that is our main source for the early years of St. Patrick's. I had many contact with ministers that were at the Episcopal Church, but my main contact in the church in St. Patrick's was Father Fontanella, and he was there for about 25 years, so he had great significance. And he was there during a time that, with Vatican II, there were many changes, and he handled them very well. That he had a church that was growing large in numbers of people, and also you take a priest that has maybe 2 assistants, and they handle 8 to 10,000 people as a congregation. So it takes a lot of coordination, and he was a very versatile man. He did not have quite the formality in his approach to things that Father Gans had, but he was an excellent priest in dealing with the things that came about. And plus, he had a great love for the old church, too, that he never destroyed anything in the old church. He had money from his own family that he restored, like the Stations of the Cross. He had them repainted. He had the murals on the wall after the fire. The murals, they were done early, but it took years and years till you got a donor to come in and do that. And Fontanella had all that stuff restored, and he used his own money. He didn't raise money for the congregation. So, and also they had a chapel at Pine Grove Furnace, and they had an old cross that came out of the church when there was a fire in 1859 on Pomper Street. There was a crucifix that they put in the basement, and Fontanella had that restored and put out at the Marsh Drive on the side. So he did many things to enhance the history and the art and architecture of the old church and of Marsh Drive. He did many things of restoring, of keeping it in good maintenance, and he did many things.
He's the other individual that I associate with St. Patrick's, and I'm wondering if that's also because he's someone who put himself out there, like Father Gans, in terms
Yes.
of.
Well, that's another, I forgot to mention, but there was an organization where all the ministers in Carlisle came together. They formed a chaplaincy for the Cumberland County Nursing Home and at the prison, and I can't remember the formal name, but Fontanella got that started. And it was like an ecumenical thing. And he would invite different ministers. And also his last years when I joined, on Sunday evening, he encouraged they would come and do their own service, like an evening prayer on Sunday evening. And even the Jewish congregation uh, group came and celebrated their ceremonies at St. Patrick's Church. And this was I think he retired, I'm not quite sure what year, but right before he retired, they had these services. So he was very ecumenical in terms of bringing in different churches in Carlisle. So that had great.
Is this the Council of Churches?
Council of Churches, that's what it is, yes. I'm trying, and prior to that, we had a priest that was there in the early 1900s, Father Welsh. And he was noted, and my family talked about him. This was long before my time. He was there prior, he came after Father Gauntz. Father Welsh was there when the Indian school, Father Gauntz was there, but he left St. Patrick's about 1903, I think. Father Welsh was there, but the significance of Father Welsh, he would visit many, many people in the Carlisle hospital that were not Catholics. And there were several people that became Catholics simply because he had a habit of going in and visiting many non-Catholics. And I also wanted to mention, when Mother Drexel built her, the school, well, the building where the rectory is, her nuns came and would do classes with Black people of Carlisle, and with Indians, they would come in and get their instructions. They also had musical instructions, put on plays and things like that. But there were many Black people in Carlisle, and Saturday mornings, I had a lady that I knew that rode the bus with me to Harrisburg. Her mother attended sewing classes and things in the early 1900s, that the nuns that came with Mother Drexel, she found her own order of nuns to deal with Black people. They set up missions all over the United States. And they dealt predominantly with Black people and with Native people all out through the West. So many people were converts. Many Indians that came here were from missions that they were Catholics before they came. So on Sundays, they would have a procession from the current barracks. And the Indian school was 1879, I think, to 1918. Mm-hmm. And Father Gauntz was very instrumental. He taught religious courses out there. He also served, that was another thing he served on a board for the United States government that dealt with the missions and gave advice all over the United States. So there were substitute priests that would come in and serve while he was on the road. But that's another thing. But the nuns also had great significance of converting many people that didn't even have a church when they were here. But they left then. When the Indian school left, the nuns left. Our parochial nuns, even the Church of St. Patrick's did not have a school until, I want to guess that it was in the early 1900s after the Indian school, because the nuns that were here with Mother Drexel did not set up a school for the parish. That came a few years later. Well, that came under Father Smith. Father Smith was another significant guy. His family owned a bakery in Harrisburg. So Father Smith, after the fire in 23, he was an assistant priest there, but he donated a lot of the money to restore the church. And he later became pastor after Father Welsh. And he was another, I never knew him, but I've read many articles and things of Father Monsignor Smith. And he was significant in terms of starting a Catholic school for the parish. So then they had different nuns up until later years when they did not have the numbers joining the convents to provide the school anymore. But they were probably, there were many of the priests that were not well known still gave of themselves, but they simply didn't have the characteristics like Fontanella and Monsignor Smith and Father Welsh and those types of priests.
Not, and a lot of it too is probably just my general ignorance. So, which is going to be apparent in this next question, because you mentioned serving in the archives committee.
Yes.
And I can't remember if you said that the adoration, was that also a committee or?
Well, we have different volunteer groups.
Okay.
There's probably 50 of them. Some make rosaries, some pray for the dead, some take communion to lay people are allowed to take communion, the reserved sacrament to sick people. So there's all sorts of committees, but I particularly liked the archives because it had the history associated with the history of St. Patrick's. And in the rectory is a large building, so there's plenty of space there. The priests live there today. And but prior to that, the priests lived, there's a house on the other side of the shrine church that it was a private residence, and then they built a convent there for the nuns when they came in the 20s. So that serves as a church office today, but that was used in the beginning for the Adoration Chapel. The Adoration Chapel didn't come until they had it in all the monasteries and things, but it didn't come to the parish until Father Fontanella, probably the last 10 years of his tenure there. He put that in. So that's another devotional thing that people volunteer. They pray 24 hours a day, and they get volunteers to come in, even during the night and things. So it's maintained, and it's another unusual thing because many parishes don't have enough volunteers to maintain an adoration chapel. But St. Patrick's is a large congregation. And we're unique that many dioceses, the Catholic Church in the diocese, do not have the influx of people to support all these different organizations. That St. Patrick's has a large congregation, mainly because Cumberland County is growing, and it's growing from the Second World War on. But the church in particular, and most churches in Carlisle, grew after the Second World War. But the Catholic Church in particular has really grown continuously. The Army War College was a big factor, but a lot of the industry here too has brought in people to Cumberland County.
My follow-up question to that would be sort of related to the committees and volunteering is, and I don't know if with the Adoration Chapel, if it's just you praying at that particular time or if there are other people, but are there anyone that you've met or that you remember working with during the committees or during your volunteering at these various?
Yes, I was always interested in finding people in the same way that when I volunteered here at the Historical Society. I volunteered here. I graduated from college in 1970. So I volunteered here from the very beginning. When we only had one staff person, it was one secretary that they paid. There was no staff at the Historical Society. We were open Monday nights. And so I've always searched out people that would know something about local history and things, and I've done the same thing in the Catholic Church. The majority of people, there was a small segment of people that was local, that belonged for years and years. And when I first joined, I always sought them out. It was the same way here at the Historical Society. I did volunteer work continuously up till today. I still do volunteer work as a docent, but I helped in the library as things expanded and things here. But I always was interested in the genealogy and plus finding the stories, not just the people, but finding the stories that go with people, because many things are taken as common things in your life and nothing's written down. Most people do not keep diaries, but certain people do keep information and keep in their mind and certain pieces of information. And that's the word of mouth and what you have in your memory many times has significance because it was never written down. So that's people I always searched out. And there were people, I'm trying to think, certain lay people. George Fowler was a person that was an old member. His family came in the 1820s to St. Patrick's and were instrumental in the early churches. But George was a lawyer here, and he knew numerous people in Carlisle and had numerous stories of how they tried to save the market house on the square not to be torn down. And he was one of the lawyers that helped fight the case for the local farmers to preserve that building. The building was falling apart, and farmers were not coming in. There was just the starting of the large farms that they couldn't compete. So it was eventually going to die, but the farmers fought it. But there were stories like that were interesting just to hear them talk of what they went to try to preserve certain things in Carlisle. And I knew a black man, Danny Hodge, that he lived close to me. And he had a wonderful memory, and his ancestors were Hodges that came from Maryland in about the 1850s, two brothers. And Danny had all this in his mind. He worked at one of the fraternities as a house father, but his ancestor was John Stanton. And in the Historical Society here, we have a broadside and we have a portrait, which is really rare of a black person. Now, they lived in Newville, but John Stanton's great-great-grandfather was buried in the Presbyterian Church. They had a section for ex-former slaves, and some were slaves, but the Stantons were buried there, and Danny knew all this history on his family. Now, he'd never talked about the portrait and the broadside. It came up for public sale, and it's a long story how we got it here, but it was a miracle that it stayed in Carlisle. But Danny had all this in his mind, so that was another person that was very interesting to talk to. And I always searched out people like that. And even in the Catholic Church then, I found several people that there was one lady that I knew lived on Pomfret Street, and her mother used to see Father Gauntz ride his horse. He did not have a car. They had a barn, and he had his own horse. And she remembered him riding his horse up and down Pomfret Street. So there were different stories like that that seem insignificant today, but it all adds to your history. So that was one thing I always searched out and then tried to find information. Our first paper was like 1785, but they did not have a lot of local history. They covered a lot of European history and things. So you have tidbits of information, but there were even notable people that would only have maybe a sentence mentioned in the local papers. So it's always a searching thing to find information on of historical things. But that's the one thing I always searched out, to see if I could find anything that nobody else talked about that was part of our history that was kind of lost, but there were tidbits of information out there. So that's
So my next question is, you would have, I think, just come back from college.
Yes.
It was like 1970, 1971.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned that shortly after that, in 72, they made the decision to build the Marsh
Yes.
Drive Church. Do you remember sort of any discussion about that? Or?
What I've heard, you always have to find donors. Even though the Catholic Church, the diocese, will finance some of the churches, they have so many churches that do not have a financial basis that the congregation, due to the geography and mobility of people, they simply couldn't afford to do things. But Carlisle was lucky. Mr. Rurrell supported, I think,
Jonas or
he was a local person with the Tire and Rubber Company, and he was here. The Tire and Rubber Company was, I think, it was founded about 2 years before Maslin's, and Maslin's was founded about 1910, and the Carlisle Tire and Rubber was founded here in about 1908. And Mr. Rurrell wasn't of that time frame, but he came later. In the 20s, he was here when the fire happened on Pomfret Street. But he was a major financial donor, and there were several other bankers and things that gave money at St. Patrick's that knew that they had to expand, and they started raising money. They raised money through the congregation, but those big donors, and Syntec, which came from the Tire and Rubber, that was made it rubberized roofing, and we have that at the Historical Society here. Mr. Rurrell was very instrumental in that. So he was, and also, when I did volunteer work at the Historical Society, before we had Todd Hall, and before we had just the main building that was built in 1875 or 6 at the entrance here, when we added, Mr. Rurrell donated money then. When I first started volunteering, they had the first executive director, Roger Steck. And I did volunteer to work to keep the books. And he had me call Mr. Rurrell to see, he gave like $50,000 at one time, which was a lot of money in the 70s, to buy artifacts and things. But he didn't care what we spent. Mr. Steck wanted to make sure that he didn't want it one particular purpose. But that was the generosity of Mr. Rurrell, that he even picked the Historical Society to donate money that we could buy artifacts and do anything we wanted. And so that was a significant person. I remember seeing him. He was in a wheelchair when I first joined, and he died shortly after that. But his family, still, he had 2 sons, and they were contributors to St. Patrick's. But many other people by that time were contributors to the Marsh Drive Church and those things. But Mr. Rurrell was, he actually purchased the farmland and then sold it to the diocese at Marsh Drive. He had great significance, and he decided to push that idea of building a church on Marsh Drive rather than disturb the old shrine church, which was, in my opinion, a miracle to save it. So he was a significant person for Marsh Drive.
Well, I think you also mentioned before we started taping that with the boom in terms of the size of the congregation, that staying downtown just would have made no sense.
Right, to have enough. Well, and one other thing I want to mention, Catholicism in the United States came about mainly with later immigrants. There were a small core of what was significant with St. Patrick's. Our first sacramental register, we had Jesuit priests that came from Maryland. Then they came up to Adams County, and that was part of York. Adams County wasn't formed to 1800. And the mission was there in the 1740s, and it came from the Chesapeake area in Maryland. And they had priests that, they were Jesuits. Many of them were people that left England and went over to France to practice their faith. The Catholic faith was underground after Henry VIII's children. The Catholic faith was outlawed in England. So we had these Jesuit ministers that came into Maryland, and they were both English and German. But at Conewago Chapel is where the old church from the 1740s, and they sent missionaries. They sent missionaries even before Carlisle had a church that is mentioned in their logs. But the unfortunate thing for genealogists is that they kept their own records So they did not, we started our first formal record of St. Patrick's was like in 1820. But we still had, and also the diocese in Harrisburg was not formed until after the Civil War in 1868. So we were under the Diocese of Philadelphia. And I think Philadelphia came about sometime later.
Baltimore.
So we were a parish under Philadelphia, and they would send missionaries. But the missionaries actually, the Jesuits served, the diocese didn't send missionaries until after the Jesuits stopped serving. The Jesuits had a very tyrannical history that they were served parishes prior to the late 1700s, but then they were served directly under the Pope. And the Pope in the late 1700s disbanded them, and they were only allowed to serve in colleges and the academic sphere. So those priests either went to teach in a college, but they did not send out missionaries anymore. So the diocese, that was responsibility was taken over by the diocese. Now this is just for central Pennsylvania. I cannot say what happened in other states and things, but our missionaries came from the Conewago Chapel, and so that's what. Oh, what I wanted to mention was that so the congregation was very small, but then when they put the canals in on the Susquehanna River, it brought in a lot of workers that were Irish in the 1820s. So our parish showed that we had significant increase. Well, I would say Jesuits did a study in Philadelphia in 1757, and they talked about we were the sixth oldest county in the state, but we had like 7 Catholic members in 1757 listed for Cumberland County in this study that they did in Philadelphia. But then in the 1820s, so you can see how small it was. They had a Catholic church in Elizabethtown. They also, in Adams County, they had Conewago Chapel. Now that was much larger. There were more people who came up from Maryland that settled in those areas, but a lot of them were German and Irish. But when the canals came, you could see the significant increase for about 20 years at St. Patrick's Church. We had a pew list from that time, and it stayed very strong when they were building canals, and I think they had a lot of Irish workers, is my guess, that came to St. Patrick's in Carlisle, because Harrisburg is very small. Even though it became the capital city, in the 18th century, it was still a relatively small community. So there was really, Elizabethtown was the closest to Carlisle, the Catholic, and then Circuit in the 1700s for Carlisle was Carlisle and York and Harrisburg. They served that circuit for probably close to the time Father Gauntz came. So we were a very small parish, and our priests were always on the circuit. But then it stayed, like I said, very small, even until the middle 1877, whenever they had a full minister. But even then, or priest, it was still relatively small compared to many of the other churches, especially in Cumberland County. It was predominantly a Protestant community. The Germans came in after the Scotch-Irish, and there were a lot of Lutherans. The Presbyterians were the very beginning Christians, pretty much in when Cumberland County was laid out. I would say there were a few Church of England people, but even the Episcopal Church in Carlisle in the 1700s, half the members were former Presbyterians, Scotch-Irish. It was like many of my ancestors that were Episcopalian. We were formerly Presbyterians prior to that time of going into. My English ancestors were actually Quakers, and that left the Quaker faith when they came to Cumberland County in 1734. But there were no Quakers pretty much in Cumberland County prior to 1750. York had quite a congregation or people, and the Quaker faith in York early. And York beat us by 1 year. They were founded in 1749. Cumberland County was founded in 1750. So we're still very, very early. But that's a little bit of the religious background. But the congregation stayed relatively small until that time.
So, were there any other changes in the church that stand out, like, aside from that you moved to Marsh Drive, over the course of your sort of remembrance of Carlisle, and maybe since you joined as well in '91?
Yeah, St. Patrick's is unique for having Dickinson College here. There's always the main pastor, and then there's there's usually assistant. Now, when I first joined, after Vatican II, the priesthood, they were not the Catholics. Catholicism went through great changes in the 30s and 40s and 50s, but by the time Vatican II hit, many of the religious orders were losing members and did not recruit as many people as what they did prior to the Second World War. In the same way with the Diocese of Harrisburg, we did not have the teaching staffs of the nuns and monks that would, and they weren't paid. I mean, they served for nothing. They had their room and board and a small stipend when they got old to live off of, but they pretty much stayed there till they died. And we did not have, we had one assistant many times, but what was unique with having Dickinson College, they usually got these young men that were just ordained. So we got a nice variety of people. And everybody has their unique style of preaching and doing, but some were more historically inclined than others. So certain priests stood out to me because I was always looking to somebody to talk about the ancient customs of the church long before the Reformation and things like that. But the priests were so busy with doing day-to-day things and burying and baptizing people that they couldn't get off on the side subjects. But there were a few that stood out. There was a young man, Shalalan. He's at Conewago Chapel today, a man in his 30s. He was an excellent historian and he studied in Rome for a while, but in his sermons and things, when he was at St. Patrick's, he's only there about 2 years. And that's usually the tenure of many assistant priests that come to St. Patrick's. They'll serve anywhere 2 to 4 years. Then they shift them into another church, and as they age, they'll give them a full parish. But many churches, they do not even have an assistant, and they're still dealing with 4,000 or 5,000 people. So it's quite a job. So you can't expect everybody to be a historian and be to talk about the things that I really enjoy. But so they stood out, certain ones that were historically inclined. So that's the one thing that always came to my mind. And so that's.
Well, this is more of a CCHS question, I guess. But did you ever have conversations with Brother Heisey?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Now, that is a unique person. Daniel Heisey's ancestors were Mennonites, like some of mine, but they were up to the time that he was raised in the Mennonite church. And he was a historian that went to Dickinson, and then he studied the Roman. Now, that's another person that went over to Rome that was an academic person, but he was studying like the government of Cumberland County in the early 1700s. He wrote several pamphlets on how it worked. He also was and plus he had a firm knowledge of Latin. And there is another man that just came to St. Patrick, a retired colonel from the Army War College. And he used to be a society, and that was a historian from 260 to 330 that wrote volumes of works in the 200s about the early churches in the Mediterranean. But Philip has a knowledge of Hebrew, of Latin, and the Aramaic language, and a notable historian. And I've learned a lot from him just in his time that he retired here in Carlisle. He's a young man in his probably very early 50s. He just might just be 50. I'm not quite sure. So you have unique people like that. And what was your
Well, I
question?
was asking you if you ever had like.
Oh, and Daniel Heisey, yes. Then Daniel Heisey became a monk
Mhm.
at St. Vincent's, where Father Gaunt graduated. St. Vincent's was formed by German Benedictines order out there, but they had the rolling beer. Do you remember what the name Rolling Stock beer? They had
Rolling Rock beer.
yes, they had in St. Patrick's in our early register. They had a distillery here, and because Europeans did not have good water,
Mhm.
so when the Germans came, they were so accustomed to both Protestant and Catholics. Germans were used to drinking, having beer, and having their own distilleries. And we had in our book, they raised money. There's a couple pages that are in German, and they raised money for a short time. And that's St. Vincent's was also supported, but then one of the bishops eventually didn't like the idea that they were raising money with having a brewery. But it was very early and it was very significant. But Daniel decided to become a monk, and he went out and studied for the Benedictine orders. And then once they knew they had such an intelligent person, he became a professor because he had his master's. I don't know where he got his master's from, but he's a very knowledgeable person, yes. And he was very active here, but his whole background was Protestant, and they were Anabaptist people. They did not have any, those people did not accept a lot of the theology of the later cast of like Lutherans have and Episcopalians, even Presbyterians have a certain amount of doctrine from the Catholic Church. But the Anabaptists, pretty much, they're strictly Bible people. They study the Bible, and they do not accept a lot of theology. So Daniel came from a totally different background, but a very unique person, yes, and has contributed a lot to both the history of the Catholic Church and also Cumberland County. That he's done all sorts in his short time before he became well, he's not a priest. He's still a monk. He never became a priest, but he's a professor at St. Vincent's. Plus, he does contribute articles for different historical journals and things like that. So Daniel Heisey is definitely a notable person that went over. And he joined, they formed a new Catholic church off the Harrisburg Pike, close to Cumberland Valley High School. And Daniel joined, because his family lived in Mechanicsburg, and that's where he grew up. He joined Mother Drexel's, there's a church named Mother Drexel, St. Catherine Drexel, off the Harrisburg Pike. So that was Daniel's church. He was never a member of St. Patrick's. He was, but people knew him because he, just a notable person, yes.
Well, I didn't know if you knew him because of the CCHS connection or.
I knew him mainly from the Historical Society here,
Yeah.
the Historical Society, yes.
Shifting gears a little bit, I'm wondering, were there community issues? We kind of discussed earlier with Father Fontanella and the Carlisle Council of Churches and sort of that involvement there. But I'm wondering, were there other community issues that you remember the church being involved in?
There were, but I'm not as familiar. The Council of Churches was the biggest thing. And, well, you know, on Good Friday, today, they still have ecumenical. I don't know, the Council of Churches still exist. And they still meet. Every once in a while, they must meet at different churches. And also, there was a thing that Debbie Miller was involved in, that the churches, part of the Council of Churches, they provide sleeping for people that don't have a house or anything. These people live on the outside, that they would provide sleeping quarters, and the church would share that. There's a name for it, but I can't remember what it was. But they still provide bedding and people, and then they can use showers and things. There's uh, like a halfway house right off of Penn Street behind the apartments there.
Talking about CARES,
Cares,
Cares.
that's what it is.
homeless
And
shelter.
that's an ecumenical thing that's shared by all the churches in Carlisle. And my one niece volunteered before she was married to, and Debbie was too, very active. And they've had that probably, could be 20 years by now, that they provide sleeping for people that don't have homes and live on the street. So they're involved in many things like that. Also, at the national diocese level, they provide a lot of those services, but it's more, they deal more with the local churches are involved in it more than other denominations and things.
Yeah.
But I also want to mention a little bit of my background in a sense. Once I got out of college, I worked at the bank for 2 years, and then I worked for the state, for the Department of Education, and for 41 years. And I was in the budget office. So that's the reason history to me was always a side thing. I had a double major. I went to community college in Harrisburg for 2 years, right when they started. The first community college was started in 64, I think, and I graduated from high school in 65. So they were located in the old academy, which was a boys' school up on 2nd Street. And in that building, before they built the Wildwood campus. So I studied there for 2 years, and then I had a double major in history and in economics. But all the jobs that were available when I graduated were pretty much financial jobs. So I always worked in the budget. I worked the last 26 years. I was an accountant for like education, for a business manager for the state prisons. That was the education for the state prisons, just out of the Department of Education. They have their own department, but I was in that for about 10 years, and then I was in for over 20 years in the budget office, and I worked in higher education. But by being in Harrisburg for all those years, I would go to visit the cathedral at lunchtime and on like holy days and things. So and also the state library had a wonderful genealogical section, so I spent many a lunch hour doing research at the state library and things. So that whole thing, the historical side that I'm interested in, was always on my side thing to do, but I always loved it. But I didn't want to be a teacher, so I pretty much spent most of my working career. And I worked in higher education. I had the 4 state-related, Temple, Lincoln, Pitt, and University of Pittsburgh. State provided 20% of their funding. So they were my schools I had to deal with, and also all the state colleges at one time run the Department of Education. Then they took out and formed their own area. So I pretty much worked with higher education most of my working career and things. So I always had a variety of things that I was interested in, and I also was always interested in investing on the side and that type of thing. But history was always my great love. And that's one thing that even in the Catholic Church, I've always been interested in the historical part of things. So that's kind of a little bit of my background that just to fill it in.
Well, so before we shift gears again to sort of you personally, I'm wondering, are there any other aspects of the history of the Catholic Church or St. Pat's in particular that you want to discuss or that stand out to you?
Well, it's a continuous growing congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And what's very interesting now, we have had some of the assistant priests are from India, the country of India. And it gives you, and we also had several Black priests. There were a couple that, one in particular, that was a very devout man, but he had an accent that was very hard to understand. And he was a very devout person, but we've had quite a variety of people as assistant priests and things. But these ones that came from India are very devout, and that's sort of a new. We never had those before, so you get it's a constantly, and I'm sure long after my time, since we have all these new immigrants and things into the United States, we're going to have clergy and things that are totally different than what we're accustomed to today. And or we've had in other parts of the United States, but we haven't had them locally in Cumberland County. So St. Patrick's is kind of a unique situation because of the county is one of the few in Pennsylvania that is growing. And Pennsylvania has a large population of retired people. So that is the reason we keep losing population, that we have a lot of colleges, but many of our younger people take jobs in other states and things that we're not growing in a lot of other areas of Pennsylvania, that Cumberland County is unique. And the trucking industry has brought in people. That's the current thing that's has great significance of bringing in new population. So as you get more people coming in, you'll get more Catholic families and things. So it's definitely a growing parish. And I can't think offhand of anything else significant.
Well, so these last couple questions here, I forget how I referred to them previously, but just sort of your own faith and sort of how it's influenced your life. Just do you recall a time when faith played a particularly important role in your life, or?
It's always been in my life. As I grow older, I learn to accept aging and that sort of thing. But I'm very happy that I had a faith to fall back on. Even before I joined the Catholic Church, it all sort of just flowed together. That faith was always in my family. We never really talked about religion a lot growing up and things. We went, but it wasn't something that. And plus, we didn't really have a devotional life that we did rosaries and things like that at the house. We always had grace after meals on major holidays, but it was kind of a laid back type faith that I grew up in. But and I've known many pastors and things of other churches and things, mainly through the Historical Society. We've had many people that volunteered here and of different religions and things. So religion played a significant part, even with the Historical Society and things like James Hamilton that founded this. He had 3 ancestors that were ministers, and I was always, so faith in Cumberland County has always had a relationship to the history of Cumberland County.
This last question, I think it's related. I think you partially answered it, but so I don't know if you have anything more to say about it, but how has your faith journey sort of influenced your life over the years?
It was always significant.
Yeah.
The faith, that's what kind of drew me to the Catholic Church, because it has so much to offer. Many other churches have significant social things, but devotional life, pretty much, even though there were changes from the early days, the first 700 years, the Catholic Church figured out their theology pretty much. And it's stayed with the church, that it has a great devotional. Many people have different things that they like. And the church provides those. There's many social things. They have an athletic field, and they have exercise classes, and they do all sorts of things. But the faith, I like the devotional side of the church, and that has been part of my life, and that'll be part of my life as long as I had my mentality and things. So,
well, those are all the questions I had, Terry. Terry, I don't know if you have anything you want to ask or.
Just one thing, and it goes exactly what you just talked about, the devotional aspects of the Catholic Church versus more social in some other ones. How did you grasp the concept of the sacraments? which is the core of the Catholic
Right.
Church. I don't know that they've got the sacraments as such in the Episcopalian Church.
Right. It's the Episcopalian, I have to explain.
Yeah.
Episcopalian is a noun that describes the members, and it's the only church. Lutherans, Catholics, Presbyterians, the term is interchangeable, but it's the Episcopal Church is the adjective, and the noun, there isn't an Episcopalian church. It's Episcopalian are the people. The sacraments are very important. That the Catholicism is a three-legged stool. You have the sacred tradition, which is what you had from the Jewish time up until in Christ, including Christ. You have the Bible, and you also have the teaching authority. The teaching authority are the bishops when they get together. So that pretty much holds the church together. So you have those three things. That the Catholic Church is not just the Bible, because the Catholic Church actually started when Christ picked Peter to be his first pope and picked his 12 apostles. I mean, that is the belief in the Catholic Church. And then you had your priesthood today. When you celebrate Mass, you're really celebrating the sacrifice that happened on Good Friday. It's not just the Seder dinner that started on Holy Thursday, but you completed with the sacrifice that happened on Good Friday. So the sacraments, basically, you have the sacrament of the priesthood, you have the sacrament of baptism, the sacrament of confirmation. But for those are for the laity. But even the laity can baptize a person in emergency. That's one of the few things that can happen, that if somebody is dying and they are not a Christian faith, that a lay person can actually baptize somebody. Marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church. So you have 7 sacraments, but they all evolved from this they figured them out. And even the Trinity, that God has 3 natures, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. It took them a while to get that concept, and that came out of the Council of Nicaea in 324. So that came before the Bible was even coordinated. You had these writings, but it was never pulled together until Jerome, like I said, with these 3 councils, the Pope appointed him to do the interpretation. So even the Protestant churches accept all the books of the Bible except 13, and we call them non-canonical. There's 7 in the New Testament and 6 in the Old. And those 13 books were, in the early days of the Catholic Church, they were not used in readings for Mass. They were not used for the devotions that the priests pray daily, the breviary, which we call morning and evening prayer today. They were not used in those 2 things. So they debated, even Jerome debated whether he was going to include them in the Bible when he first formed it or not. And so that whenever the Protestant Reformation came, a lot of the Protestant founders did not accept those books. But so they're called the Apocalypse,
Apocrypha?
Apocrypha, yes. They were set aside. So that's the history kind of, and plus the 7 sacraments are the basis, pretty much how they explain to people the doctrines of the Catholic Church and things. But yes, that's
Sanctity.
yes. But it evolved. I mean, in a sense, it didn't happen without a lot of controversy and things back and forth. I mean, there were many, many groups that would accept part of the Catholic doctrine before the Reformation and things. There was always a struggle, even in the early churches. And that's why these early historians like Eusebius and St. Augustine, they would write down of what was going on. But there were battles. I mean, among the Peter and Paul did not agree on everything. So, I mean, there was always a certain amount of friction, and Christ did not write any of the books of the Bible. So all of this, and plus his disciples, that was the one reason that they decided to write down the New Testament and things, that they wanted to record what Christ had said on his missions and things. And there's many things that were by word of mouth. And even of the Jewish faith, they had the law. The Jewish faith, except, well, Christians have the first 5 books, but supposedly Moses wrote Genesis, and the Jewish people had the law. Now, the law was not part of Christianity. That's kind of unique to the Jewish people, but the first 5 books of the Bible are pretty much the Torah. That's what makes up that. So the Catholic Church brought from all these, and the word of mouth was the big thing, that a lot of the sacred tradition was the word of mouth that they passed down. There were major libraries in like Alexandria and everything. I'm trying to think of the Mediterranean conqueror of the Greeks. Do you know Blair? It's like 450 years before Christianity, before Christ.
It's not Alexander or?
Yes. Alexander and his father. All these places that they found in the Mediterranean, in what is now Algeria and in Egypt, and of course, Eusebius was in Palestine, and all that area of Mesopotamia, and then Constantinople. The Christian faith, after it left Rome, when the Germans were coming in, the Vandals and things, destroying a lot of Rome, the government all went to Constantinople. And for the next 900 years, they survived. And Christianity really grew in the West.
Yeah.
When the church in the East just held on, it was still there in the West. But in the East, it actually flourished. And Christianity was spread all through that area until the Muslims came about. But the Muslim religion was, like, I think in the late 1600s, early, I mean, not the 600s
Yeah.
and the 700s when it started to come about. But Christianity really spread all through that Mediterranean area. I mean, that's where you get like the sacred tradition and things that were basic part of the Catholic faith.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. We still had bits and pieces. Now, a lot of it was lost with all the wars that went on because, I mean, the wars, they did not take prisoners in a lot of places, and they just burnt everything to the ground. Even today, you will not find Hippo and Carthage have different names. And Constantinople is also Istanbul today. So, I mean, it's many of the things, even on the old maps in the very early days, are not there. You have to have an old map to figure out where they were. But that Christianity had its beginnings, I mean, and it spread out in that Mediterranean area of that was where it was.
All right, well, anything else or?
I think.
Well, thank you. It was
Beautiful answer.
very interesting talking.